In the winter of 1970, Roger and Carolyn Perrone moved their 5 daughters into the old Arnold estate. It was a massive 200-acre property in Harrisville, Rhode Island, a perfect slice of quiet countryside living. But the peace didn't last. The family quickly noticed clocks freezing at specific recurring times. Unseen forces moved through the rooms. Heavy wooden doors would suddenly slam shut in the dark, entirely on their own. The escalation terrified the parents. They realized they were entirely out of their depth against whatever was occupying their home, forcing them to seek outside help. The family observed that these events were too coordinated to be structural house noises. They believed they were living with a presence that was actively aware of their arrival. To assess the situation, the family brought in renowned paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren. During the investigation, the psychological terror turned strictly physical. Carolyn Perrone was resting on her sofa when she was hit by a violent muscle spasm, followed by a sharp, piercing pain in her calf. When she examined her leg, she found a puddle of blood welling up from a deep, perfectly concentric puncture wound. This raised an immediate, terrifying question for the investigators. How does a supposedly formless spirit inflict a precise physical injury that matches the strike of an actual weapon? To identify what attacked Carolyn in 1970, the team had to dig into the blood-stained history buried in the estate's soil. The Warrens didn't start with exorcisms. They went straight to the local town hall, pulling property deeds and historical death records. They uncovered a geographical anomaly. For 8 consecutive generations, one single extended family had lived and died on that exact 200-acre plot of land. This sprawling 19th century family tree reveals unnatural spikes of violent death, drownings, hangings, and unsolved murders. These fatal incidents form a geographical cluster, with decades of tragedy all terminating at the exact footprint of the farmhouse. Lorraine Warren concluded that the property housed an apex predator spirit, a dominant entity that controlled the lesser ghosts trapped on the grounds. She identified this apex predator as a specific historical figure, a local woman named Bathsheba Sherman. Back in the 1800s, Bathsheba lived on a neighboring farm. Even in life, she carried a dark reputation among the local residents. This sketch reflects the coroner's gruesome discovery. The baby didn't succumb to natural causes. The fatal injury was a thick sewing needle driven directly into the infant's skull. Despite the horrific finding, the local courts cleared Bathsheba of murder charges because they lacked the physical evidence to secure a conviction. The legal system let her go, but the town delivered its verdict. Locals condemned her as a witch, convinced she sacrificed the child. Bathsheba died in 1885, yet the highly specific, horrific nature of that needle murder cemented her legacy into the earth of the estate. Fast forward to the 1970 investigation. The Warrens took the details of that 1885 murder weapon and compared them directly against the fresh wound on Carolyn Perrone's leg. Looking at the comparison on screen, the results are chilling. The perfectly round, concentric puncture mark on Carolyn's calf is an exact geometric match for the profile of a heavy 19th century sewing needle. The implications for the family were severe. The entity in their home actively weaponized its historical method of killing against a living mother. This forensic match indicates a specific historical crime was physically repeating itself. The Perrone family endured this violent ordeal for an agonizingly long time, remaining trapped in the home for a full decade. They finally managed to leave the cursed old Arnold estate behind, packing up and moving far away in 1980. The physical evidence of that concentric needle wound serves as a tangible bridge, connecting a 20th century family directly to a 19th century murder. Ultimately, the horror of the Perrone estate shows that some hauntings are simply historic crimes that refuse to stay buried in the dirt.
Driving through Gettysburg at night, a tourist's dashcam captured pale, human-sized silhouettes darting directly through the fog. Investigators across the country document hundreds of similar reports, ranging from solid shadow figures to electronic voice recordings of unseen entities. These recordings cluster heavily around 2 specific locations: the rocky fields of the Gettysburg battlefield and the decaying wards of Waverly Hills Sanitarium. Why do these specific sites consistently produce such vivid, terrifying recordings, while thousands of other historic buildings remain completely silent? To understand why a place appears haunted, we have to look past the legends and reverse engineer the verifiable tragedies that occurred within these specific walls. Today, those exploring Waverly Hills frequently report solid black masses darting through the corridors, but in 1926, this massive structure was built as an isolated fortress. Its sole purpose was to quarantine thousands of victims suffering through a raging tuberculosis epidemic. Before antibiotics existed, the medical consensus was brutal. Doctors forced patients to endure fresh air therapy, leaving them exposed on open porches in freezing winter temperatures. When exposure failed, surgeons resorted to a procedure called thoracostomy. They removed up to 7 or 8 ribs from fully conscious patients, purposefully collapsing the infected lung in a desperate attempt to starve the disease. The extreme mortality rate quickly overwhelmed the facility. To manage the sheer volume of corpses, staff utilized a 500-foot underground tunnel. This hidden chute allowed them to transport dead bodies away from the main building discreetly. If the living patients saw the constant stream of the dead, doctors feared they would surrender their will to fight the disease. The dark figures and whispered demands for silence recorded today mirror those final, desperate days. The phenomena reflect patients hidden away in the dark, suffering out of sight. A completely different pattern emerges hundreds of miles away in Pennsylvania. Visitors walking the rocky heights of Little Round Top and Devil's Den consistently report encounters with wandering, displaced soldiers in torn 19th century uniforms. These sightings trace back directly to July 1863. Over 3 days, the fields of Gettysburg became the site of extreme, chaotic violence. This chart shows average battle casualties of the era, but Gettysburg spiked to an estimated 51,000 dead and wounded in just 72 hours. The armies marched on, leaving behind a massive logistical failure. Thousands of fallen soldiers were left scattered across the rocks and fields, abandoned to the elements without a proper burial. Waverly Hills is a scar of slow, quiet decay. Gettysburg, by contrast, is a scar of sudden, catastrophic trauma. Those translucent shapes rushing across the dashcam footage make sense in this context. The spirits appear to still be charging, because for them, the battle and the burial were never finished. Skeptics can easily dismiss electronic voice phenomena as stray radio frequencies, and blurry dashcam figures as car headlights catching isolated patches of fog. But whether these recordings capture literal spirits or simply our own psychological projections onto dark spaces, the cultural result is identical. These paranormal legends serve as a societal alarm bell. They force modern generations to look back and remember the marginalized tuberculosis patients and the unburied soldiers whose suffering might otherwise be forgotten. America's most haunted places retain their terrifying grip on our imagination. The ghosts are a matter of debate, but the unimaginable human tragedies that fueled the legends remain documented history.
For 38 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the relentless hammer strikes never once stopped. The result of that endless labor sits in San Jose, California. It is a sprawling Victorian mansion filled with staircases that terminate directly into ceilings and doors that open out into sheer 2-story drops. It was a labyrinth designed with a singular, chilling purpose: to confuse and trap anyone or anything wandering its halls. The architect of this chaos was Sarah Winchester. Following the sudden deaths of her infant daughter and her husband, she inherited a massive fortune, but she was entirely consumed by a paralyzing, inescapable grief. Desperate for answers, she sought out a spiritual medium who delivered a terrifying diagnosis. Sarah was told her family was cursed, hunted by thousands of vengeful souls whose lives had been cut violently short by her family's primary product, the Winchester repeating rifle. Convinced she was the target of an army of the dead, she believed the only way to outrun these specific spirits was to trap them inside an unsolvable physical puzzle. If the construction never ceased, the ghosts could never settle. Sarah spent her entire fortune attempting to build a barrier against the dead. Humans possess a strange capacity to go to extraordinary, irrational lengths to construct physical walls against our own fears. It forces us to ask a difficult question. Are we really trying to hide from spirits, or are we desperately trying to outrun our own profound guilt? While Sarah Winchester dedicated her life to hiding from ghosts, modern culture has taken the exact opposite approach. We no longer run, we actively hunt them down, armed with cameras and recorders, obsessed with capturing undeniable proof of the afterlife. Take the Stanley Hotel. Sitting isolated in the snowy peaks of Colorado, this historic building has become ground zero for modern paranormal thrill seekers hoping to document the impossible. Recently, a tourist sweeping their camera across the confirmed empty lobby snapped a burst mode photograph. When reviewed, the image revealed a distinct figure of a woman standing completely still on the grand wooden staircase. This desire for visual validation extends far beyond a single tourist photo. Decades earlier, the terrifying events at the Amityville house drew in professional investigators who treated hauntings not as folklore, but as crime scenes requiring definitive proof. High-profile demonologists like Ed and Lorraine Warren legitimized this analytical approach. They brought systematic observation into spaces previously ruled by pure panic. During their Amityville investigation, an automatic infrared camera trap set in the darkness snapped a photograph that remains highly debated today. It shows what appears to be a deceased young boy with glowing eyes, quietly peering out from a bedroom doorway. We share and analyze these terrifying images endlessly, but our societal fixation on capturing them is actually driven by a comforting, desperate need. We want scientific assurance that human consciousness survives, that death is not the final, silent end. Naturally, a fierce skeptical counterargument pushes back against this narrative. Critics point out that almost all visual proof of ghosts can be neatly explained away by mundane environmental factors. Consider the Myrtles plantation in Louisiana. For years, visitors claimed to photograph haunted handprints appearing from the inside of the estate's glass doors. Investigators eventually demonstrated that these purported spectral prints were often just residual chemical smudges reacting to heat on the antique glass. Visual anomalies are actually quite easy to debunk. But the debate becomes complicated when investigators record harder-to-explain physical phenomena. Things like electronic voice phenomena, audio recordings capturing unseen voices responding to questions, or waking up with physical needle punctures in completely empty rooms. At the Gettysburg battlefield, visitors don't just report seeing shadows. They report tactile interactions, like having actual, heavy 19th century ammunition placed into their hands by phantom soldiers wandering the tree lines. We spend all our energy arguing over whether a photograph is real or fake, but getting trapped in that debate distracts us from looking closely at the underlying geography. There is a deeply specific pattern to exactly where these phenomena occur. If we stop asking if ghosts exist and start asking exactly who these reported ghosts are, the entire picture shifts. The entities reported in the dark halls of Waverly Hills are not random spirits. They are directly tied to the massive, localized casualty event of a tuberculosis epidemic, where thousands of patients slowly suffocated in those exact beds. The legends surrounding the Myrtles plantation revolve exclusively around the enslaved people forced to work there. The localized hauntings trace back directly to a documented history of systemic slavery and human abuse. This animated map plots America's most famous haunted locations as individual data points. When we layer in the historical record, the pins align perfectly with the sites of our most significant mass casualty events. We are looking at the front lines of the Civil War, the epicenter of a respiratory epidemic, and the brutal infrastructure of the Southern slave trade. At every stop, the common thread is a legacy of profound human suffering. These hotspots serve as geographic markers. They map the specific locations where national trauma was most concentrated, functioning as an archive of unhealed wounds. Which brings us back to Sarah Winchester. The miles of twisting hallways she built were never actually meant to trap ghosts. She was desperately trying to process the unbearable weight of her family's violent legacy, manifesting her internal trauma into physical architecture. A haunting provides the frame through which we process collective trauma. In the end, we don't haunt these locations. Our history haunts us.